Welcome to Back This Channel. Story: the desert had a way of swallowing men whole. It stretched out endlessly, a sea of ochre sand and jagged stone where the wind never stopped its whispering, and the sun bore down like an unrelenting overseer. In this vast emptiness walked a single man, an Apache warrior without a tribe, without a home, and without a family. He moved with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that haste was death in these lands. His moccasins left light impressions on the sand, each step carefully placed, as though he carried not only his own weight but the burden of ghosts that trailed behind him. His name had once meant something. He had been called by his people, by his wife, by his children, but those voices were gone now, stolen by flames and bullets. He was the last of his band. Once they had been a proud group, living off the land, hunting deer in the mesas, gathering mesquite beans and wild herbs, moving with the seasons as their ancestors had for centuries. But the white man came with rifles, soldiers, and broken treaties. They came not only to take the land but to erase the people upon it. One by one, his kin were scattered, some cut down in raids, others forced into barren reservations where the spirit of the land no longer spoke. He carried in his heart the memory of one night in particular, the night when fire consumed his camp. He had been out hunting when he saw the glow in the distance, the orange flames licking the sky, and he heard the distant screams carried on the wind. By the time he returned, there was nothing left but ash and silence. His wife and his two small children lay among the ruins, their bodies charred, their lives stolen. That night, something inside him withered. He buried them beneath the desert soil, leaving a small cairn of stones as their only monument. Since then, he had wandered alone. The warrior had no destination, only a need to keep moving. He traveled across sun-scorched plains, through canyons where the shadows of cliffs stretched like arms reaching for him, and along dry riverbeds where cracked earth testified to the absence of rain. Sometimes he hunted small game, jackrabbits, lizards, or quail, just enough to survive. At other times, he went hungry for days, sustained only by cactus fruit and the bitter taste of endurance, in the quiet of his solitude. He often spoke to the spirits of his ancestors. He asked them why he was spared when all he loved was taken. He asked them if there was still purpose in his steps or if he was simply a ghost walking among the living. The wind never answered, but sometimes it seemed to carry faint echoes of drums and chants, reminders that he was not entirely forsaken. The white man called men like him renegades, those who refused to bow their heads or accept the iron shackles of reservation life. To the Apache, he was simply a survivor. Yet survival without kin, without laughter, without the shared warmth of a fire at night, felt hollow. He bore his loneliness like a scar across his soul, one that could not be healed. His body showed the toll of his wandering years. His hair, once black as raven wings, had streaks of gray. His face, lined and weathered, looked carved from the very stone of the mesas. His eyes, however, still burned with a quiet intensity, the kind that only those who had endured great suffering could carry. He spoke little, for there was no one to speak to, but his silence was not weakness. It was the silence of the land itself, deep and enduring. Sometimes he crossed paths with settlers' trails, wagons cutting through the desert, their wheels biting into sacred soil. He kept to the shadows, watching but never approaching. He had learned that nothing good came from being seen. The settlers feared his kind, and fear made them quick to shoot. He avoided soldiers whenever he could, for they carried orders to hunt men like him, to capture or kill. Yet despite all he had lost, despite the endless horizon of grief that stretched before him, he continued to walk. Something inside him, perhaps stubborn pride, perhaps the stubborn will of his ancestors, refused to let him lay down and die. Each sunrise found him alive. Each nightfall found him staring into the stars, asking the old questions again. It was in this state, half man, half ghost that he came upon the silence that would lead him to the most haunting sight of his wandering years. But before that moment, before the discovery that would brand itself upon his soul, he was simply what he had been for so long, the lone wanderer of a broken people, carrying the weight of a vanished world across the endless desert. The desert had its own music. Even in stillness, there was always some note, some faint sound that reminded a traveler he was never truly alone. A hawk's cry overhead, the rattle of pebbles disturbed by a lizard's quick dash, the ceaseless hiss of wind weaving through dry grass and stone. The Apache had come to rely on those voices. They spoke to him as companions, warnings, and sometimes comfort. But on this day, as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, that music faded. The air turned heavy, as though even the wind held its breath. The stillness was not ordinary. It was a silence with weight, one that pressed upon his ears until it became louder than sound itself. He stopped in his tracks. His instincts, honed by years of hunting, raiding, and surviving, told him that silence such as this was no accident. The earth was uneasy. Animals knew when death lingered, and they hid themselves. Birds fell quiet, insects withdrew, and the desert seemed to retreat into itself. The warrior bent low, pressing his palm against the hot earth. It told him nothing, yet he could feel the strangeness in the air, like a storm waiting to break. His dark eyes scanned the horizon, jagged cliffs in the distance, a stretch of mesquite trees, and the dry bed of a river that hadn't seen water for months. Everything looked the same as always, but he knew better than to trust what the eye alone revealed. He tightened his grip on the spear he carried, its shaft worn smooth from years of use. His bow and quiver rested across his back, each arrow fletched with hawk feathers. He did not yet draw a weapon, but his muscles tensed, ready for the strike of danger. He moved forward cautiously, each step measured. The air was cooler now as the sun's fire waned, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Those shadows seemed to move with him, stretching and curling in unnatural shapes. A shiver ran through him, not from cold, but from the knowing that something waited ahead. His thoughts drifted to old teachings. Elders of his tribe had often spoken of silences that were not of nature. They warned of places where spirits lingered, where battles had been fought and blood spilled, leaving the land scarred and restless. Sometimes the spirits cried out. Other times they hushed the world around them. This felt like one of those places. Still, he pressed on. A lone man could not afford to turn back simply because the land whispered of unease. Hunger, thirst, and the endless need to move forward pushed him into the heart of the silence. As he walked, he noticed the tracks. At first, faint disturbed earth where boot heels had pressed too deeply, leaving behind the sharp edges of leather solace. White man's prints, fresh. His jaw tightened. He followed them with his eyes, tracing the path they cut toward the trees ahead. There, among the mesquite and cottonwoods that stood like weary sentinels, the silence thickened. It was as if he had stepped into another world, one cut off from the pulse of life. Even the air seemed reluctant to move, hanging in a dead weight around him. The Apache's senses sharpened. His ears strained for any hint of sound, perhaps a horse shifting its weight, a man's breath, the click of metal, but there was nothing. Only the silence, oppressive and unnatural, as though the earth itself had been commanded to hold its tongue. His heart beat harder, not from fear but from anticipation. He knew he was approaching something, perhaps danger, perhaps revelation. His eyes searched the trees, the low branches, the shadows that clung to the trunks. Then a smell reached him, faint but undeniable. The scent of death. Not the sharp, fresh tang of blood, but the heavy, sickening odor of flesh beginning to sour in the heat. His stomach tightened, though he forced his breath steady. Death was no stranger to him. He had lived among it for too long. Yet this smell, mixed with the silence, stirred unease deep in his bones. He advanced slowly, each step deliberate. The tracks of the white men ended here, their path disappearing into the clearing between the trees. Whatever had been done here. The sun dipped lower, its dying light filtering through branches, painting the clearing in streaks of red and gold. The beauty of it clashed with the dread in his chest. His hand hovered near his bow, ready to draw if need be, but still he did not turn back. For a lone wanderer, there was nowhere to turn back to Dot as he stepped fully into the clearing. The silence seemed to close around him, like a blanket thrown over his senses. He knew now with certainty something awaited him here, something that would mark this day in his memory forever. The Apache entered the clearing with his breath held, as if to disturb the silence would bring whatever force lingered here crashing down upon him. His eyes moved first to the ground. Instinct demanded it. Tracks told stories, and stories told truths. The soil was disturbed, the prints of horses and boots overlapping, pressed deeply into the earth. Many men had stood here, and not long ago. Their passage was fresh, their trail heavy with intent. Then his eyes rose. Dot at first. He thought it was only a tree, its branches twisting against the dying light. But as his gaze sharpened, the shape became clearer, a form swaying gently in the faint breeze, hanging from the thickest branch. His heart clenched. Dot, it was a girl. Young, no more than 12 or 13 summers, her small frame too light to still the motion of her body as it swung slowly, side to side. The rope around her neck creaked faintly, the only sound in that suffocating silence. She was Apache. He knew it at once. Her dark hair, though tangled and matted, bore the same raven-black hue as his own. Her dress was made from deerskin, stitched with care in a way no white hand would have bothered with. She had been one of his people, perhaps from a band still clinging to life somewhere in the mesas, but now she was only a body. His chest tightened as he took a slow step forward, his eyes catching on something that dangled against her small chest. Not a necklace. A sign that it was a piece of rough-hewn wood hung around her neck with rawhide. The words carved into it were crude, but he could read them. White man doesn't forgive. The words burned into him like hot iron. He stood frozen, his body rigid with grief and rage. The message was clear. This had not been a killing in haste or anger. It was deliberate, staged. A warning. The white men wanted this child to be found, her body left like a banner of terror strung from a tree. They wanted her people, his people, to know there would be no mercy, no forgiveness. He forced himself to move closer. His hand trembled as he reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her lifeless face. Her eyes were closed, her expression strangely peaceful, though her death had surely not been so. He wondered who she had been. Someone's daughter, perhaps someone's sister. Had she been taken from her family in a raid? Had she seen her kin slaughtered before the rope tightened around her throat? The warrior's throat constricted. He had buried enough of his own dead to know this feeling, yet each new death struck with the same force as the first. He lowered his gaze to the sign again. Those words carried more than cruelty, they carried arrogance. The settlers and soldiers did not simply want land. They wanted to erase even the memory of Apache life, to claim the earth as if no people had ever walked it before them. The warrior closed his eyes and breathed deeply. His grief was dangerous. It could break him if he let it. But grief, tempered by rage, could also sharpen into something harder than steel. He reached up and began to untie the rope. The knot was tight, hardened by the sun, but he worked it patiently until at last the girl's body came free. He lowered her gently into his arms, cradling her as if she were still alive. She weighed so little, her frame fragile, almost bird-like. Too small, too young to carry the cruelty of such an end. He laid her down carefully upon the earth, smoothing her dress, arranging her limbs with respect. She would not remain here as a warning to terrify her kin. She would be returned to the land with dignity, as their people had always done. For a long moment he knelt beside her, his head bowed. The desert was still silent, but now he understood why. The land itself mourned her. His eyes lifted to the horizon, where the last light of day burned red against the jagged cliffs. That color so vivid, so violent, seemed to echo the fury rising inside him. The white men believed they had sent a message with this killing. They had, but not the one they intended. He touched the girl's hand one last time, then rose to his feet. The words on the sign echoed in his mind. White man doesn't forgive. Neither, he thought, do the Apache. He stood over the girl's body as the last of the sun slipped behind the cliffs, shadows creeping across the clearing. The silence pressed heavier now, not just the stillness of nature, but the silence within himself, the silence of memory stirring, awakening old wounds. The sight of the girl's lifeless body pulled him backward through time, into the firelit corridors of his mind where screams still echoed. He remembered another night, one carved into him like a scar that would never fade. It had been late summer when the soldiers came. Their boots struck the earth with a rhythm of conquest, their rifles flashing like jagged lightning in the dark. He had been hunting then, chasing a deer across the ridges, when the smoke first caught his nose. By the time he returned, his village was already consumed. He saw the flames' first bright tongues clawing into the sky, devouring the brush huts and storage shelters. He ran faster, his lungs burning, but the fire was swifter still. He heard cries, shouts, the panicked wails of children. Then came the sharper sounds, the cracks of rifles, the thud of bullets tearing through flesh, the agonized gasps that followed. When he reached the camp, it was no longer a home but a slaughterhouse. His wife, whom he had loved since they were children, lay crumpled near the doorway of their lodge, her hair tangled with ash, her chest still bleeding. Near her, the small shapes of his children, two bright stars extinguished before their time, rested motionless. His legs had nearly given way beneath him, but grief had not been enough to shield him from rage. That night, he swore vengeance, though he knew vengeance could never fill the emptiness left behind. He buried his family beneath the desert earth with his own hands, covering them with stones so that coyotes would not disturb their rest. He had placed a piece of turquoise in his wife's hand, the same one she had worn on their wedding day, and kissed the foreheads of his children for the last time. Then he had walked away from the ruins of his village, never to return. And now, here she was, another child, another daughter of the Apache, cut down in cruelty. The memories crashed together, blurring the faces of his own children with hers, until it seemed the earth was littered with the bodies of the young, all taken before their lives could bloom. The weight of it pressed on his chest until he could hardly breathe. He sat on his heels beside the girl, clutching a handful of earth, squeezing it until it sifted through his fingers. This was the same soil his ancestors had walked, hunted, and preyed upon. To him, the land was not separate from the people, it was a living being, a spirit that carried the heartbeat of every generation. When one Apache died, the land itself mourned. When many died, the land grieved with a silence that stretched for miles. The settlers, the soldiers, the white men who came with fire and iron, did not see this. To them, the land was something to be cut into parcels, fenced, owned, and sold. To them, the Apache were obstacles, shadows to be cleared away so that plows could dig into the flesh of the earth. They did not understand that to kill the Apache was to wound the land itself. The warriors' memories shifted again, this time to voices, the council fires where elders spoke of treaties made and broken. He remembered the cautious hope that perhaps peace could be found, only to watch it crumble when white men came again, demanding more land, more surrender, more submission. They do not know the meaning of enough, one elder had said. Their hunger is endless. To feed it is to die, And so the Apache had resisted. Raids, ambushes, hit-and-run strikes against wagon trains and forts. They had fought with bows, lances, and stolen rifles, always outnumbered but never surrendering easily. He had fought among them, a younger man then, fierce and proud. But each victory was followed by harsher reprisals, each raid answered with massacres. The war was not equal. It was not meant to be. Looking at the girl, he felt the weight of all those years pressing down upon him, a mountain of sorrow built from the bones of his people. He wondered how many more would die before the land was emptied, before the Apache were little more than whispers carried by the desert wind. His hands trembled, but not from weakness, from fury, from the unbearable truth that the child at his feet was not the first and would not be the last. He closed his eyes and whispered in his language, the words of mourning and remembrance taught to him long ago. He called to the spirits, asking them to guide her safely, to welcome her among the ancestors. As he spoke, he felt the old grief within him blend with this new one, fusing together into something sharp and unyielding. The white man said he did not forgive. But the Apache could not forget Dot, and he, alone, broken, yet still breathing, would carry this memory forward. Night was descending now, washing the desert in shades of indigo and ash. The last warmth of the sun drained from the air, replaced by a chill that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The warrior knelt beside the girl's body, the folds of his buckskin leggings gathering dust, his breath visible in the cooling air. He felt the weight of his ancestors pressing upon him. The dead demanded ceremony, no matter how poor or broken a man was. To leave her here, dangling as a trophy, would be a betrayal of everything Apache blood stood for. He reached into the small leather pouch tied at his belt. It was worn thin with years, yet it still held what little medicine he carried: sage, cedar, tobacco, and a pinch of corn pollen. Gifts of the earth. Sacred things. He had gathered them himself in times of solitude, offering prayers as he picked each one. These herbs were not merely plants. They were vessels for words, for breath, for the connection between flesh and spirit. He began by clearing the ground, brushing away twigs and loose stones, creating a small circle beside her body. He placed her hands across her chest, arranging them with care, as though tucking her in for a final rest. Then he set a sprig of sage near her, crushing it between his palms until its sharp, cleansing scent filled the air. Dot with slow, deliberate movements. He fanned the smoke from his small ember toward her body, letting it drift across her face, her chest, her feet. "So the spirits know you are coming," he whispered, his voice low and steady. His words were Apache, the rhythm of them like a song without melody. He sprinkled corn pollen around her head in a circle, marking her passage into the next world. Each grain glimmered faintly in the fading light, tiny stars laid upon the earth. Tobacco he held tightly for a moment, then scattered in the 4 directions: east, west, north, south. His hand lingered longest toward the west, where the sun had vanished, the direction of the afterlife. The warrior bowed his head. He prayed for her journey. He prayed that her spirit would not wander lost, tethered to the cruelty of her death. He asked the mountain spirits to guide her steps, to place her feet upon the right path. He asked the ancestors to greet her, to tell her she was not alone, even though her life had been cut short. His prayer was silent to the ears of the desert, but thunderous inside his chest. He spoke not only for her, but for all who had gone before his wife, his children, his people who now lay beneath stones or burned in the ruins of their homes. Each name rose in his mind as though they stood around him, listening. For a moment, the loneliness that had stalked him for years seemed to recede, and still, beneath his reverence, anger stirred. His prayer did not ignore it. Instead, it folded it into the ritual. For he knew that the spirits, too, had seen what was done to their children. He told them he did not pray for forgiveness. He prayed for strength, for clarity, for the endurance to keep walking, to keep carrying their memory even when the world tried to erase it. A night wind picked up, soft at first, then steady, carrying with it the scent of mesquite and dry earth. It bent the grass and stirred the branches of the tree where she had hung. The sound was almost like a voice, a low murmur through the leaves. The warrior paused, listening, and for a heartbeat he thought he heard words in it. Not in English, nor in Apache, but in the language of the earth itself, a tone of sorrow, of acknowledgement. He closed his eyes, pressing a palm against the soil. "I hear you," he whispered. When the prayer was done, he placed the pouch of herbs on her chest. It was all he could give her, his last offering. He would not take it back. The desert would claim it, and through it, perhaps, the spirits would know she had not been abandoned. The stars were bright now, piercing the sky with cold light. He looked upward, following their familiar patterns. His people believed the spirits of the dead walked among the stars, shining down as reminders that no one truly vanished. He tried to picture the girl's soul joining them, free from the rope, free from the cruelty of men. For a long time he knelt in silence, his head bowed, his breath steady. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. His knees ached, his back stiffened, but he did not waver. The prayer had given him more than he had expected. It had bound him, once again, to the duty of remembrance. The girl was not just another victim. She was now part of him, part of the story he carried forward. Her name he did not know, but her death was carved into his soul. The white men had left their message. But so had he, here in the silence of the desert, beneath the stars, with sage smoke curling around the body of a young Apache girl. His vow was unspoken, but it burned within him. This prayer was not an ending. It was a beginning. When the last traces of smoke from his prayer faded into the night sky, the warrior's eyes returned to the rough plank of wood that had hung against the girl's chest. It lay in the dirt now, the rawhide strap torn when he cut her down. The letters carved into it caught the faint silver of starlight, their shapes jagged and uneven. "White man doesn't forgive." The words stared back at him, more cutting than any blade. He crouched, lifting the sign into his hands. The wood was crude torn from a wagon plank, perhaps, or the side of a crate. The carving had been hurried, the knife gouging deep, angry strokes. This was not the work of a single man acting alone. It was a performance, a message. The warrior turned it over, tracing the grooves with his fingers. He felt the rough edges, smelled the faint tang of pine sap. He had seen signs like this before. Not these exact words, but the same intent. White men nailed such things to trees, left them on burned wagons, scrawled them on the walls of trading posts after raids. They carried a simple language. We rule here. But this sign went further. Its cruelty lay not only in the killing, but in the staging. A child strung up, branded with these words. It was not meant for her, her spirit had already fled. It was meant for the living. A calculated strike at the heart of the Apache, a message designed to plant fear where bullets could not reach. The warrior knew the tactic well. The white soldiers and settlers believed fear was a weapon stronger than rifles. They thought if they could make the Apache afraid enough, broken enough, the people would scatter like coyotes before fire. Fear was their true campaign. They called it pacification. He called it war against the spirit. He stared at the words again, tasting them in his mouth. Doesn't forgive. Forgiveness, this was the white man's obsession. They spoke of it in their prayers to their foreign god, preached it in their wooden churches. Yet here was their truth, forgiveness for themselves, never for others. The phrase was not a confession, it was a boast. The warrior thought of the treaties his people had signed, words pressed into paper by those who could not be trusted. Time and again the Apache had agreed to peace, only to watch white men break their promises as soon as they wanted more land, more water, more gold. Each time the Apache resisted, the whites answered with massacres. To them, resistance was unforgivable. To them, the very act of being Apache was unforgivable. He set the sign down beside the girl's body. The words were poison, but he would not let them sink into him. He had lived long enough to know the truth. It was not forgiveness the white men sought, but submission. The message carved into the wood was a demand, not a statement. It said, "You will bow. You will break. You will be erased." Yet standing there, he realized something else. Fear cut both ways. To leave such a message meant the white men feared the Apache still. They feared the raids, the ambushes, the shadows of warriors moving silently through the desert night. If they truly believed the Apache were defeated, they would not have bothered to stage this spectacle. The sign was not only arrogance, it was desperation. A reminder to themselves as much as to anyone else that their grip was strong, that their power was unquestioned, but he knew power built on cruelty always cracked. The land remembered. The people remembered. The spirits remembered. The warrior crouched again, touching the earth beneath the tree where the girl had swung. He pressed his palm flat against the soil, feeling its quiet pulse. The earth absorbed everything, blood, tears, bones, and it never forgot. Someday, he believed, the weight of these crimes would return upon those who committed them. Maybe not in his lifetime, maybe not in the next, but the balance of the world could not be denied forever. He straightened, his eyes lifting to the horizon where the moon rose, pale and watchful. The girl's death, and the sign that branded her, was meant to sow terror. Instead, it had sown fire. The words echoed again in his mind. White man doesn't forgive. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists. Neither did the Apache. The desert had always been harsh, but now it felt alive with rage. The moon hung high, bathing the clearing in pale silver light, and the Apache stood like a stone carved from the earth, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the ground. The girl's body lay at his feet, the crude sign discarded beside her. His prayer had eased her spirit into the arms of the ancestors, but his own soul found no peace. What stirred inside him now was not sorrow alone. It was fire. At first. It flickered quietly, a spark born from grief, trembling at the edges of his heart. But with every breath he took, with every memory that rose, the burning of his village, the faces of his wife and children, the countless broken promises, it grew hotter, brighter. He felt it surge through his chest, climb into his throat, burn behind his eyes. This fire was not of wood or grass. It was the fire of resistance, the flame his people had carried for generations against enemies who thought them already defeated. White men believed fear would break the Apache. They believed signs like the one he had read tonight would shatter the spirit of his people. They were wrong. Fear did not weaken him. Fear did not drive him to submission. Fear transformed into fury, into a vow that tightened every muscle in his body. He remembered his father's words from long ago, spoken beside a council fire when he was just a boy. The Apache heart is like flint. Strike it, and sparks will fly. But keep striking, and you will set the whole desert ablaze. Those words had sounded like poetry then. Now he understood them as prophecy. His life had been stripped bare, no family, no tribe, no home. The white men might think such a man broken, already defeated. Yet in truth, he realized such a man was dangerous. With nothing left to lose, he carried the weight of the dead upon his shoulders and could strike where they least expected. He could move like a ghost through the canyons, strike swiftly, vanish into the night, carrying with him not just his own anger, but the anger of all who had fallen. The warrior looked down at the girl again. She had been too young to fight, too young to raise a bow or wield a spear. Yet in her death, she had become a warrior too. Her body, desecrated as a warning, had instead become a banner to him, a call to rise. He would carry her memory as he carried the memory of his children. The enemy had meant to silence her. Instead, they had given her a voice louder than any living cry. He touched the earth again, pressing both hands flat into the soil. The coolness grounded him, steadied the blaze in his chest. He whispered to the land, to the mountains and rivers, to the stars above. I will not let them erase us. I will not let them bury our names beneath their fences and fires. The wind shifted then, carrying the faintest sound across the clearing. It was not the silence of death this time, but the low moan of the desert itself, a sigh that rustled through the branches. To his ears it was as if the land approved, as if the spirits themselves acknowledged his vow. His fire grew steadier, not the wild blaze of reckless anger, but the controlled burn of purpose. He knew he could not strike blindly. He could not waste his strength in meaningless fury. The Apache way was patience, precision. A rattlesnake did not lash out at every shadow. It struck only when the moment was right, and when it struck true. He breathed deeply, letting the desert air fill his lungs, feeding the fire within but tempering it with resolve. Each breath carried away weakness, each exhale hardened his heart. He was no longer just a lone wanderer mourning the past. He was a vessel for something greater, the will of a people who refused to vanish. The ember of a fire the white man could never truly extinguish. Rising to his feet, he looked one last time at the girl. You are not forgotten, he said aloud, his voice low but steady, meant for her spirit, for the stars, for the earth itself. Your death is not in vain. He turned toward the horizon. Beyond the clearing lay the desert, vast and endless, but no longer empty. It was his ally, his shield, his weapon. And within him, the fire burned, a fire that would not forgive, a fire that would not die. The moon had climbed higher now, a pale guardian watching over the desert. The clearing lay behind him, heavy with sorrow, but the warrior lingered one last time at the girl's side. He had done all he could: prayer, ritual, remembrance. She would not lie forgotten on the branch of a tree like some crude warning. She had been returned to the earth, and through the earth to the spirits. Still, leaving her felt like leaving a piece of himself. He knelt once more, resting a hand gently on her small shoulder. I carry you with me, he whispered. His words were soft, yet they carried the weight of an oath. He had no tribe left to witness it, no council of elders to bless it, but the desert was his witness, and the stars bore silent testimony. He rose, gathering his few belongings. His bow, his spear, his pouch of herbs, these were all he owned. Yet in this moment he felt as if he carried something far greater. The girl's death had woven itself into his very being. Her story, though wordless, had become his burden and his weapon. The warrior stepped from the clearing into the open desert. The silence followed him at first, still thick, still watchful. But as he walked farther, the land seemed to breathe again. Crickets began their faint chorus, a coyote barked in the distance, and the whisper of the wind returned across the sand. The desert was alive once more, as though it too had waited for him to rise from his prayer. His feet moved steadily, guided not by hunger, not by the search for shelter, but by the fire burning within him. He did not yet know where his path would lead, toward allies, toward enemies, perhaps toward death. But he knew with certainty that he was no longer wandering without purpose. His steps carried meaning again. For too long, he had been a ghost among the living, drifting with grief as his only companion. Now, though grief still walked beside him, it no longer chained him. It had transformed into resolve, into a blade sharpened against the stone of suffering. He thought of the words on the sign, "White man doesn't forgive." A threat, a curse, a declaration of endless hatred. But as the wind cooled his face and the stars lit his path, he realized the words could be turned. Forgiveness was not a language the Apache had ever needed from their oppressors. Forgiveness was a weapon denied to those who had wronged them. If the white man could not forgive, then neither would he. His vow was not to chase blind vengeance. It was to endure, to resist, to keep alive the ember of his people's spirit. He would not allow the memory of the girl or his family or the countless others lost to be erased. As long as he breathed, they breathed with him. Ahead, the desert stretched vast and unbroken, its ridges silver under the moonlight. To many, it was emptiness. To him, it was sanctuary, teacher, and ally. The canyons would hide him, the mesas would guard him, the wind would carry his steps where enemies could not follow. The land was harsh, but it belonged to the Apache as they belonged to it. Together they could outlast any empire. He paused once, turning his head back toward the clearing. Though it was far behind now, he could still see the silhouette of the tree rising against the night sky. For a moment, he thought he saw her there not hanging, but standing, small and unbroken, her face lifted to the stars. He blinked, and the vision faded, leaving only the tree swaying gently in the wind. A final farewell. He turned forward again, tightening his grip on his spear. His steps carried him into the open desert, each stride firm, deliberate, steady. He was no longer the lonely wanderer who drifted without aim. He was a man bound by oath, walking a path laid not by choice but by necessity. The fire within him burned low but steady, like coals in the heart of a hearth waiting, enduring, ready to flare when the moment demanded. His people's enemies had left a message in cruelty. He would leave his answer in survival, in resistance, in the refusal to vanish. The desert accepted him once more, its night winds wrapping around him like a cloak. He vanished into its vastness, a single figure swallowed by the horizon. Yet the vow he carried glowed as bright as the stars above, an ember against the darkness. The white man did not forgive. Neither did the Apache. And as long as one warrior walked the earth, their fire would never die.